Welcome to Family Shadows, where we tell stories that dig into the unseen corners of family life. The places where love wrestles with disappointment, where sacrifice hides behind silence, and where dignity sometimes speaks louder than words. If you find yourself moved by these stories, if they echo something in your own heart or remind you of someone you love, we invite you to subscribe and walk this journey with us. These shadows are not just ours. They belong to every family. Today's story is titled, "My son said I was holding back his career, so I let him pitch without my safety net." James Miller had always believed that a man's worth wasn't measured by the noise he made, but by the steadiness of his hands. At 65, retired from a long career in construction engineering, his hands bore calluses that no amount of retirement leisure could sand away. They were the hands that had poured concrete foundations in the biting cold of Chicago winters, that had raised beams under summer suns that could melt the asphalt. They were also the hands that had cradled a newborn boy, his firstborn, nearly 3 decades earlier, the same boy who now accused him of holding back his career. That boy was Jason Miller, 28 years old, brimming with the kind of restless ambition that only youth can afford. Jason had eyes that never stopped moving, scanning opportunities, chasing promises in the shifting world of technology startups. He carried himself with a confidence that looked like courage to outsiders, but sometimes struck his father as fragile bravado. Then there was Grace, the younger sibling, 25, quieter in presence but sharper in perception. She had inherited her mother's empathy and her father's steady gaze. If Jason was a storm chasing the horizon, Grace was the harbor. The Miller family lived in a modest suburban home just outside Boston, where the hum of commuter trains was a daily reminder of lives always in motion. James had retired early, partly because his body demanded it, partly because he wanted to be present for his children's adult years, in a way he hadn't always managed when they were small. His late wife, Margaret, had often been the bridge between his stoic silences and the children's unfiltered emotions. With her gone, James sometimes felt like he was learning a new language at an age when his tongue no longer wanted to bend. Jason's venture, Miller Tech, was his dream, a company he envisioned as the next great disruptor in cloud-based project management. He spoke of it with the zeal of a preacher at a revival tent. He described it at family gatherings, over late-night calls, even in passing conversations with strangers. His words painted castles in the air, elegant and unshakable, but James had spent a lifetime knowing that castles built without foundations always tumbled. It began with a dinner. The Millers had a tradition, stubbornly upheld even as life pulled them in different directions. Sunday dinner. James would roast chicken the way Margaret had taught him, potatoes crisped at the edges, carrots softened just enough to yield to the fork. Grace often helped set the table, arranging napkins with an attention to detail that reminded James of her mother. Jason, however, came late that evening, phone in hand, voice already lifted with the intensity of business talk. "Sorry, Dad," he muttered, sliding into his chair, eyes still on his glowing screen. Investor call ran long. James didn't answer right away. He'd grown accustomed to these apologies, half offered, half distracted. Instead, he carved the chicken, placing a piece onto each plate, steady and deliberate. It wasn't until the meal had begun, until the hum of conversation had settled into the rhythm of forks and knives, that Jason spoke words that landed like a hammer blow. "Dad," he said, looking up with sudden seriousness, "if you really believed in me, you'd sign as guarantor for the loan. Without it, Miller Tech can't move forward. I need that backing. Investors need to see confidence, and if my own father won't stand behind me, then," he paused almost theatrically, "then you're holding me back." The words hung in the air like smoke. Grace looked down at her plate. The clatter of cutlery stopped. James's hand, steady even in storms, rested on the knife. He felt a flicker of heat rise in his chest, not anger but something heavier, a sorrow that pressed against his ribs. He wanted to remind Jason of the years behind them, the tuition checks, the quiet sacrifices, the night he had signed away a small parcel of land he'd planned to retire on, just to keep Jason afloat after a failed venture. He wanted to tell him that belief wasn't measured in signatures, but in the decades of support that had already been poured like unseen concrete beneath his dreams. But James said nothing. Silence had been his companion for too many years to abandon now. Instead, he looked at his son with the eyes of a man who had built walls tall enough to withstand wind but knew they could not protect a heart. Jason mistook that silence. He leaned back, frustrated. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You never understand, you never believe." Grace finally looked up, her voice soft but edged with worry. "Jason, maybe Dad's just," but Jason had already returned to his phone, muttering about meetings, proposals, and potential partners. The dinner continued, but the warmth had gone out of it. Later that night, James sat in his study, an old desk lamp casting shadows across stacks of papers. On one sheet was Jason's latest proposal, slick graphics, bold claims, soaring revenue projections. On another was James's own handwriting. Careful notes, margin scribbles, columns of numbers that didn't add up. He thought of Margaret, gone 5 years now, who used to say, "James, you give in too easily to silence. Sometimes children need to hear the no, not just feel it." He wondered what she would say now. Would she urge him to sign, to stand beside Jason's dream even if it meant walking into financial peril? Or would she remind him that love, true love, sometimes meant stepping back and letting pain be the teacher? James leaned back, eyes closing against the weight of it all. He thought of Jason's words, "You're holding me back." And in that moment, he wasn't sure if his son's accusation was an act of blindness or a mirror held up to his own fears. The night stretched on. Outside, autumn leaves scraped across the driveway like restless thoughts. Inside, James sat in the quiet, his heart torn between the urge to rescue and the wisdom to refrain. He remembered Jason as a boy, running across Little League fields, shouting, "Dad, did you see that?" After catching a ball, he remembered the pride in his son's eyes when James clapped, the way belief had once been so simple, so unspoken. Now belief was tangled in contracts, in loans, in risk assessments. Now it was measured not by clapping hands but by the willingness to gamble futures. James whispered into the silence, though no one could hear. "Son, I have always believed in you, but I cannot mortgage both our lives on belief alone." And with that, Chapter 1 of this story, the dreamer's ambition, settled into the shadows of the Miller household. The following Sunday came like all the others, though James felt its weight before the table was even set. Grace arrived early, carrying a pie she had baked from her mother's old recipe book, the one that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and nostalgia. She moved quietly through the kitchen, setting dishes down, trying not to stir the unspoken tension that had lingered since last week's dinner. James noticed her carefulness. He noticed how she watched him, as though measuring the space between silence and speech, waiting to see which he would choose. "Your mother used to hum when she baked that pie," James said at last, his voice low, almost gravel. "It used to fill this house before you could even smell the cinnamon." Grace smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I remember. I think that's why I keep making it." He wanted to tell her he appreciated it, that it kept Margaret alive in ways he couldn't put into words, but the sound of the front door slamming cut him off. Jason entered, the echo of his phone call still in the air. "Yeah, I'll get the projections over tonight," he said into the phone, dropping his coat on the back of a chair. "No, listen, this is going to happen, trust me." When he finally slipped the phone into his pocket, he turned to the table, his confidence carrying him like a current. He kissed Grace on the cheek absently, nodded to his father, and sat down as though the room were already waiting for him. Dinner began, the clinking of silverware attempting to stitch together a fragile piece. But peace wasn't what Jason had carried with him. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork with deliberate precision, as though the motion itself carried weight. His eyes, bright with a mixture of defiance and desperation, fixed on his father. "Dad, I've been thinking. Investors need assurance, and the fastest way to give them that is with your backing. You've got assets, you've got a name people respect. If you co-sign the loan, doors will open. Otherwise," his jaw tightened, "otherwise you're the reason this company can't take off." Grace froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. James didn't speak at first. He'd been expecting the words, maybe even rehearsing his answer in the quiet of his study. Still, hearing them aloud, hearing his son reduce decades of sacrifice to a single accusation, it landed like a blow. Jason pushed on, mistaking silence for hesitation. "Do you know what it feels like, Dad? To have an idea that could change everything and know that the only thing standing between you and success is your own father's fear?" James's eyes narrowed slightly, though his voice stayed level. "Fear isn't the word, Jason. Prudence is." Jason laughed bitterly, a sound that didn't belong in the warmth of the dining room. "Prudence. That's what you call it. You've spent your whole life playing safe, pouring concrete, building other people's visions. I'm not you, Dad. I don't want to end up retired in a quiet house with nothing to show but calloused hands." Grace's breath caught. She wanted to intervene, to soften the edges of Jason's words, but something in her father's posture kept her still. James didn't flinch. He set his fork down slowly, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and met his son's gaze. "And what exactly do you think this house is, Jason?" "Nothing. These calloused hands paid for your education, kept food on this table, gave you the chance to even dream about Miller Tech." The words were measured, but underneath them lay a river of old exhaustion. Jason leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Dreams don't pay off if you don't take risks. You're too cautious to see it. You'd rather protect a pile of savings than invest in your own son's future. That's not belief, Dad, that's control." The silence that followed stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Grace finally spoke, her voice trembling but steady enough to cut through. "Jason, maybe Dad's not saying no because he doesn't believe in you. Maybe it's because he does." Jason shook his head, dismissing her words as if they were smoke. "You don't get it, Grace. You've never wanted to build something big. You're content with small dreams, but I'm not." Her cheeks flushed, but she stayed quiet. James wanted to say more. He wanted to tell Jason about the night he'd sat up calculating numbers until dawn, realizing that the loan his son wanted could sink them both if the company faltered. He wanted to tell him that belief wasn't blind faith. It was the courage to say no when the stakes demanded it. But what came out instead was quieter, simpler. "Son," he said, his voice low, "love doesn't always sound like yes." Jason's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "Then maybe your kind of love isn't what I need right now." He left the table, grabbing his coat in one swift motion. The door slammed again, leaving only the smell of roasted chicken and cinnamon pie to fill the vacuum. Grace sat frozen, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. James reached for his water glass, steady hands masking the storm inside him. He took a slow sip, then set it down carefully as though the act of control could steady his heart. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the meal. The pie cooled on the counter, untouched. The house was quieter after Jason left, though not in the peaceful way silence sometimes blesses a home. This silence pressed down like heavy air before a storm, thick with words that hadn't been spoken. Grace cleared the plates softly, the clink of porcelain almost apologetic, as though even sound might reopen wounds. James sat still at the table, his hands folded in front of him. He watched his daughter's movements, her gentle care in stacking dishes, and thought of Margaret. She would have filled the room with warmth after a quarrel, her laughter dissolving tension like sunlight breaking through clouds. Without her, the house sometimes felt too big, its walls echoing every sharp word longer than they should. When Grace finally sat across from him, her eyes searched his face. "He doesn't mean it, Dad," she said quietly. He's just chasing something he doesn't want to lose." James nodded, though his gaze drifted past her. He wasn't angry at Jason. He was tired in a way that didn't come from age or from work, but from watching love misread as obstacle. That night, after Grace had gone home, James retreated to his study. The desk was crowded with papers, proposals from Jason, spreadsheets with optimistic curves, and behind them James's own meticulous calculations. He had circled numbers in red ink, written notes in the margins, overestimation, unsustainable burn rate, dangerous liability. He leaned back, eyes blurring. His mind wandered through corridors of memory. He remembered Jason at 10 years old, standing in a little league uniform 2 sizes too big, shoulders squared as if he were already a man. The game had ended badly, 3 strikeouts, a missed catch, and Jason's chin trembling as he kicked at the dirt. James had walked him to the car in silence, only speaking once they were buckled in. "Failure's not the end," he had said simply. "It's the tuition you pay for learning." Jason had nodded, wiping his eyes, but James wondered now if those words had sunk too deeply, if they had planted in his son a belief that failure was always just a stepping stone, no matter the cost. Another memory rose, sharper, more painful. Jason's first startup at 21, a tutoring app that promised to revolutionize online learning. James had mortgaged a small parcel of land he'd inherited, land he had once planned to retire on, just to help Jason secure funding. The company folded within a year. Jason apologized briefly, promised he'd do better next time, and moved on. James never mentioned the land again. There had been other sacrifices, too. Nights spent driving across town to cover Jason's rent when investors pulled out. Weekends repairing Jason's old car so he wouldn't lose clients. Quiet sacrifices. Sacrifices never spoken of because James believed love was measured in deeds, not reminders. Now, staring at the papers spread before him, James felt the weight of every one of those choices pressing against his chest. Jason thought his father was holding him back, In truth, James feared he had held him up too long, shielding him from falls that might have taught him resilience. He pulled open a drawer and took out a faded photograph. It was Margaret, holding both children when they were small. Jason perched on one hip, Grace on the other, her smile radiant, her hair catching the sunlight. James traced the edge of the picture with a thumb that trembled more than he liked to admit. "What would you say to him now, Maggie?" he whispered into the stillness. "Would you tell me to sign? Would you remind me that dreams are worth the risk even if the numbers don't add up?" The photograph, of course, didn't answer. Later that week, Grace visited again. She found her father in the garden trimming back the rose bushes that Margaret had planted years ago. The air smelled of earth and faint sweetness. "Dad," she began cautiously, "Jason called me. He said he's got a big investor meeting lined up. He's upset with you." James didn't look up from his work. "I know." Grace hesitated. "He doesn't see what you've already done for him, all the things you gave up. I don't think he even remembers." James straightened slowly, his back stiff, shears dangling in his gloved hand. "He shouldn't have to remember," he said. "That's not why I did it." "But maybe he should," Grace pressed gently. "Maybe if he knew the cost." "No." James's voice was firm, though not unkind. He set the shears down, wiping his hands on his jeans. "A father's sacrifice isn't a debt. It's a gift. Reminding him of it would turn love into a ledger. That's not what family is." Grace studied him, her eyes soft. "But what if he never understands?" James looked out over the roses, red blooms opening despite the pruning. "Then maybe understanding isn't the point. Maybe surviving the fall is." That night, alone again, James opened Jason's proposal one more time. He tried to read it not as a father but as the man he used to be, the engineer who assessed blueprints for flaws before they could bring a building down. And what he saw was familiar: beautiful lines, lofty vision, but weak support. He knew then, with clarity that settled into his bones, that he could not co-sign the loan, not this time. To do so would not be love, it would be betrayal, the kind of betrayal that teaches a son that safety nets will always appear, no matter how reckless the leap. James closed the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and turned off the light. In the darkness, he whispered once more to the memory of his wife. "I'll let him fall, Maggie, but I'll be here when he stands back up." The email came late on a Tuesday night. James was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea, when Jason's voice suddenly filled the room from the doorway. He hadn't heard the door open. Jason had a way of appearing suddenly, like a gust of wind that didn't bother to knock. "Dad," Jason said, his face lit by the glow of his phone, "this is it. This is the big one." James raised his eyes, steady but tired. "What is?" Jason crossed the room in quick strides, setting his phone down on the table between them. On the screen was an email header: invitation to pitch Eastbrook Capital Partners. "They're huge," Jason continued, his words tumbling over one another. "Eastbrook's backed companies that went public in 3 years. They don't just throw meetings around, Dad, they are selective. And they want me. They want Miller Tech." James leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses to study the screen. The email was formal but enthusiastic, offering Jason a 30-minute slot in New York City, a chance to present his company to the partners. Jason could hardly contain himself. "Do you realize what this means? If I land this, I don't need the loan. I don't need a bank. This could change everything." James read the email again, slower this time, letting the words sink in. He heard not just opportunity but danger, the kind of danger that came when hope ran too far ahead of preparation. "When is it?" he asked. Next Friday, Jason said. They want me in their office downtown sharp at 10. Dad, this is everything I've been working toward. James set the phone down gently, folding his hands in front of him. And what exactly are you pitching them? Jason blinked, almost offended by the question. The company, the platform, the vision, the numbers, of course. The numbers, James repeated, his tone even. The same ones you brushed past at dinner last week. Jason's jaw tightened. I'll polish them. I just need time. What I need from you. He leaned in now, his voice lowering into something almost conspiratorial. What I need is for you to come with me. Sit in the room. Don't even talk if you don't want to. Just be there. Your presence alone, your name, it'll mean stability to them. They'll see I'm not just some kid with a dream. They'll see legacy. They'll see backing. James held his son's gaze, searching for the boy he used to walk to Little League, the boy who once believed his father's applause was the only endorsement that mattered. Now it seemed his son's faith required boardrooms and bank accounts. Jason, he said slowly, why do you think my sitting in a chair makes your company stronger? Because perception is everything, Jason burst out. Don't you get it? These people don't just invest in products, they invest in people. They want to see roots. They want to know there's something behind me. You've built a life, a reputation. I need that weight in the room. The silence that followed was long, stretching between them like an invisible bridge neither was willing to cross. Finally, James nodded once. I'll come, but understand this, I won't speak. I won't sell your dream for you, that's yours alone to carry. Jason's relief was immediate, his shoulders loosening, his smile breaking wide. That's all I ask, Dad, just you in the room. Grace heard about it 2 days later. She stopped by with groceries, finding her father repairing a loose hinge on the back door. When he told her about the pitch, about the trip to New York, she frowned. Dad, are you sure? James straightened slowly, rubbing the stiffness from his knees. He asked me to be there. That doesn't mean I'll save him. It just means I'll watch. Grace looked at him with that mix of admiration and worry that only daughters can carry. And if he fails? James's eyes softened. Then maybe he'll finally learn what success demands. Not charm, not vision, discipline. She set the grocery bag on the counter, her movements brisk, but her heart uneasy. She wanted to believe her father's silence would be enough, but she knew Jason too well. He didn't read silence as love. He read it as absence. The week that followed was a storm of preparation, though most of it happened far from James's eyes. Jason called investors late into the night, rehearsed his slides in coffee shops, rewrote figures on scraps of paper that he left scattered across the house. James noticed them when he passed through the living room, the same projections, the same optimism, only rearranged. He wanted to offer guidance, to sit beside his son and walk him through the numbers like he once walked him through homework problems. But every time he approached, Jason waved him off. I've got it, Dad, don't worry. And so James returned to his own quiet rituals, morning walks, tending to the garden, evenings with a worn paperback and the company of silence. Yet beneath it all, his chest carried a steady thrum of unease. When Friday arrived, dawn found him already awake, suit pressed and tie laid out on the bed. He hadn't worn a tie in years, but something about the occasion demanded it. Not for him, for Jason. As he adjusted the knot in the mirror, he saw his reflection and thought of Margaret. She would have been proud, he decided, not of the tie, not of the meeting, but of the fact that he was showing up, even if showing up meant nothing more than sitting quietly while his son reached for the sky. At 9 o'clock, father and son boarded the train to New York. Jason sat with his laptop open, slides glowing in front of him, lips moving silently as he rehearsed. James sat beside him, hands folded, watching the blur of autumn trees rush past the window. Neither spoke much. But the silence this time was not empty. It was heavy, full of hope, fear, and the unspoken truth that both of them knew. Something important was about to happen, and nothing would be the same after. The city greeted them with its usual indifference. New York never slowed down for anyone. Dreamers and cynics alike moved through its veins, carried along by the roar of traffic and the rhythm of hurried footsteps. Jason walked fast, his leather shoes clicking on the pavement, tie loosened just enough to look effortlessly confident. James followed a step behind, steady as always, his pace unbothered by the tide of people surging around them. Eastbrook Capital's offices were perched high above the city, in a tower of glass and steel that seemed to vanish into the autumn sky. The lobby gleamed with polished marble, the kind that reflected faces back at you, reminding visitors just how small they were compared to the empire they were trying to enter. Jason strode to the reception desk, his voice bright. "Jason Miller, Miller Tech, 10 o'clock. The receptionist smiled professionally, tapping at her keyboard. "Yes, Mr. Miller, they're expecting you. Please wait, someone will escort you shortly." Jason turned to his father, his smile wide, the kind of smile that tried to swallow nerves. "This is it, Dad." James nodded, his expression calm. "It's your moment, Jason, make it count." A young associate appeared to guide them up, ushering them into an elevator lined with mirrors. Jason adjusted his jacket, practicing his smile in the reflection. James stood tall, hands clasped in front of him, his own reflection unchanging. On the 32nd floor, they were led into a conference room that looked more like a stage than a meeting space. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in morning light, the skyline sprawling endlessly behind the long polished table. At its head sat 3 men and 1 woman, all in tailored suits, their eyes sharp, their folders already open. Jason inhaled deeply, his chest expanding as though to match the grandeur of the room. He set his laptop on the table, connected to the screen, and with a click Miller Tech's logo appeared in bold letters. "Good morning," Jason began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "My name is Jason Miller, and I'm here today to introduce you to the future of project management." His words poured out like water from a well-practiced stream. He spoke of vision, of revolutionizing the way companies coordinated tasks, of efficiency gains that sounded like salvation. His slides glowed with numbers that soared upward, charts that climbed like ladders into the clouds. For the first 15 minutes, the partners listened with polite interest, nodding occasionally, jotting notes. Jason's confidence grew with every slide, his gestures larger, his voice rising with conviction. He glanced at his father once, as if drawing strength from his silent presence. James sat quietly at the edge of the room, hands folded, eyes steady. But then the questions began. A man in a gray suit leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Miller, your revenue projections are ambitious. Could you walk us through your assumptions for user acquisition in the first year?" Jason hesitated. His rehearsed rhythm faltered for a heartbeat. "Of course," he said quickly, flipping to a slide. "We're projecting exponential growth based on market trends and user behavior studies." "And what are your churn rates?" the woman at the table asked, her tone clinical. "How many users do you expect to lose month over month?" Jason's eyes flicked to the screen. His slide had no answer. "We anticipate retention will be high," he said vaguely. "Our platform is sticky. Once people adopt it, they'll stay. The gray-suited man raised an eyebrow. Data. Jason cleared his throat. We're still in early testing, but feedback has been positive. Another partner, silent until now, tapped his pen on the table. Your burn rate. You're asking for $5 million in seed funding. At your current expense projections, how long until you're out of cash? Jason's confidence cracked just slightly. He glanced at his notes, flipping through slides that danced around the question but never answered it directly. His words began to quicken, piling on top of each other, trying to fill the void where numbers should have been. James felt his chest tighten. He had seen this moment coming, like a builder who knows the foundation has cracks even before the first storm hits. His son's castle was beautiful, but its walls were hollow. Jason pushed through, raising his voice as though volume could substitute for evidence. The point is, Eastbrook's investment will give us the runway to dominate the market. Once we achieve scale, profitability follows naturally. The woman leaned back, her arms crossed. Naturally. Jason faltered. For the first time, he looked toward his father, not for words, but for something steadier, reassurance. James's face remained calm, but his eyes were heavy. He did not speak. He would not speak. The silence grew thicker. Jason turned back to the table, his voice softer now, almost pleading. Miller Tech is more than numbers, it's vision, it's the future, and with your backing we can make it real. The room stayed still, pens poised above notepads, eyes cool, unmoved. And in that stillness, James knew the storm had arrived. The conference room seemed to grow colder, though the morning sun still poured through the glass walls. Jason's voice, once buoyant and commanding, now trembled at the edges. He clicked through slides faster, hoping motion might disguise uncertainty. But the partners weren't interested in bright graphics anymore. They leaned forward, their questions sharper, their tone heavier. One of them, a silver-haired man with the kind of presence that filled a room without effort, spoke slowly, his words deliberate. Mr. Miller, vision has its place, but capital is not invested in vision alone. It's invested in discipline. So let's talk discipline. What does your cash flow look like for the next 12 months? Not the projections on this slide, the actual line-by-line numbers. Jason froze. He had rehearsed passion, not precision. His mouth opened, then closed again. He tapped at his keyboard, pulling up a chart, but the figures were vague, broad strokes, colorful bars, no detail beneath them. We're confident growth will cover our burn rate, Jason said at last, trying to regain composure. With early adopters and strategic partnerships, revenue will ramp quickly. The initial runway should be. The woman interrupted, her voice flat. Confidence is not cash flow. Where are your assumptions? Where's your contingency if the partnerships don't materialize? Where are your safeguards if adoption stalls? Jason's pulse quickened. He glanced again at his slides, as if the missing numbers might appear if he clicked hard enough. The walls of the room seemed to draw closer, the eyes around the table more piercing. He looked to his father again. James sat at the end of the table, hands clasped, silent. His stillness was both anchor and weight. Jason's throat tightened. Mr. Miller, another partner pressed, we need to know your company's survival plan. At your projected spend, how long until you run out of money? Jason stammered, words catching. It depends on user growth. With scale, the silver-haired man shook his head slowly. No, with scale is not an answer. Without cash flow discipline, vision collapses under its own weight. Jason's chest heaved. For the first time, the fire in his voice faltered into something that sounded like fear. His hand tightened on the edge of the laptop, knuckles white. And then James moved. Not dramatically, Not with fanfare. He simply reached into the worn leather folder he had carried with him, the same one Jason had dismissed weeks earlier, and slid a packet of papers onto the table. His movements were calm, methodical, like a craftsman laying out tools he'd used all his life. The partners leaned forward. Jason's eyes widened. "This," James said quietly, his voice steady, "is a risk analysis I prepared. It covers projected cash flow, burn rate, and sensitivity tests for market volatility. It's the same analysis I shared with my son before today." His words were not sharp, not condemning. They were measured, the tone of a man who had spent a lifetime reading blueprints for cracks before the walls went up. The woman picked up the packet, flipping through the pages. Charts, numbers, realistic assumptions, conservative forecasts, the kind of data investors respected even if they didn't like what it revealed. The silver-haired man skimmed a page, then set it down with a faint sigh. "Mr. Miller, this is thorough, but if your father saw these risks, why didn't you?" Jason's mouth went dry. He stared at the papers as though they were weapons turned against him. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. I thought the vision would outweigh the risks." The woman's gaze sharpened. "Vision without a plan is a gamble, and we don't gamble with millions." The silence that followed was devastating. Jason looked at his father again, not with defiance this time, but with something rawer, more painful, betrayal or realization. Even he wasn't sure. James didn't meet his son's stare. His eyes remained on the table, steady, unyielding. For the first time in his life, Jason understood what it meant for his father not to save him. The partners conferred in low voices, pages rustling softly as they passed James's packet back and forth. The polished table reflected their bent heads and sharp suits, a silent jury weighing the fate of Jason's dream. Jason stood frozen at the end of the table, his mouth dry, his palms damp. His carefully rehearsed pitch, once so full of fire, now felt like ash on his tongue. Every chart he had flashed across the screen seemed childish compared to the sober weight of the numbers now resting in front of the investors. Finally, the silver-haired man looked up, folding his hands neatly. His voice was calm but final. "Mr. Miller, your passion is evident. Your vision has merit. But vision without a solid financial plan is a liability. Eastbrook Capital cannot proceed." The words landed like a gavel. Jason blinked, as though the sentence had come in a language he couldn't quite understand. He opened his mouth, desperate to salvage something. "Wait, if you'll give me a week, I can refine the numbers, I can." The woman shook her head gently, though her eyes were not unkind. "We don't invest in corrections. We invest in readiness, and right now you're not ready." Jason's breath hitched. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow bursts. The room around him blurred, the skyline beyond the glass, the investors' composed faces, even his own slides glowing uselessly on the screen. And then his gaze fell on his father. James sat still, his hands folded, his face unreadable. He had not spoken more than a handful of words the entire meeting, yet his presence filled the room. He had brought the truth into the open, not with anger, but with quiet certainty. Jason's throat tightened. In that silence, he realized something devastating. His father had chosen not to shield him. For the first time, James had let him stand without a net. The meeting ended quickly after that. The investors offered polite handshakes, perfunctory words of encouragement about trying again someday. Jason's hand trembled as he shook theirs, though he forced a smile that cracked at the edges. When they stepped into the elevator, Jason leaned against the mirrored wall, his reflection pale and drawn. He stared at his father, his voice hoarse. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" James adjusted his tie slowly, his eyes fixed on the glowing floor numbers descending. "I knew the numbers didn't hold. That's not the same as knowing the outcome." Jason's laugh was bitter, almost a choke. "You let me walk into that room and crash. You could have saved me." James finally met his son's eyes, his own steady, heavy with years. "And then what, Jason? You walk out with a deal built on illusions. You drown in debt 6 months from now because no one stopped you." Jason's mouth opened, then shut. His chest heaved, anger and shame wrestling inside him. The train ride home was quiet. Jason stared out the window, the city shrinking behind them, his reflection in the glass overlaid with the blur of autumn trees. His phone buzzed in his pocket, messages from friends, from potential partners, but he ignored them. James sat beside him, his posture relaxed, though inside he carried the storm of a father's ache. Every fiber of him wanted to reach out, to place a hand on his son's shoulder, to say, "I'm sorry." But he knew this silence had a purpose. Some lessons could not be taught with comfort. Hours passed in wordless tension. The countryside rolled by, the sun dipped lower, and still neither spoke. It wasn't until they pulled into Boston, stepping off the train into the cool evening air, that Jason finally broke. His voice cracked, almost childlike. I thought this was my shot." James exhaled slowly, the sound more like a sigh than an answer. "It was a shot. Just not the one you thought." Jason swallowed hard, eyes burning. He turned away, ashamed of the tears threatening to spill. For the first time he felt not just the sting of rejection but the sharp edge of reality. The collapse of his dream was brutal, but somewhere deep beneath the wreckage, a foundation was waiting, the kind his father had been building all along. The walk from the station to the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that hummed with unsaid things. The street lamps flickered on as dusk folded into night, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks. Jason walked a step ahead, his shoulders slumped, his usual stride stripped of its swagger. James followed at his usual steady pace, his silence no longer distance but presence, like a hand at his son's back, steadying without touching. Inside the house, Jason dropped his bag by the door and sank into a chair at the kitchen table. He pressed his palms to his face, elbows resting on the worn wood. For a long time, the only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock, each second falling heavy into the space between them. James hung his jacket, loosened his tie, and finally sat across from his son. He studied him quietly, seeing not the ambitious entrepreneur but the boy who once cried after striking out, the boy who used to believe his father could fix anything. When Jason finally lifted his head, his eyes were red, his voice frayed. "I don't get it, Dad. I worked so hard, I believed in this, and it still wasn't enough." James leaned forward, folding his hands. His voice was low but firm, each word weighed carefully. "Jason, belief is not a substitute for discipline. Passion is not a plan. You ask me to back you, but backing doesn't mean pretending the ground is solid when it's not." Jason swallowed, his throat tight. "So you just let me fail?" James shook his head slowly. "No, I let you face the truth. There's a difference. If I had saved you in that room, you would have walked away with investors' money and a debt you couldn't carry. That's not love, that's sabotage dressed as kindness." Jason's eyes filled again, his voice breaking. It felt like betrayal. James's gaze softened, his face lined with the tenderness of years. "Son, love sometimes feels like betrayal when it's really protection. Sometimes the best thing a father can do is let his child stumble, because the stumble saves them from a fall they might not rise from. James's gaze softened, his face lined with the tenderness of years. Son, love sometimes feels like betrayal when it's really protection. Sometimes the best thing a father can do is let his child stumble because the stumble saves them from a fall they might not rise from. The words hung between them, heavy yet liberating. Jason leaned back, blinking hard, the sting of shame mingling with a dawning clarity. For the first time he began to understand, not fully, but enough, that his father's silence had been its own kind of love. Grace arrived later that evening carrying leftovers in a foil-covered dish. She found the two of them sitting at the table, no raised voices, no slammed doors, just a quiet that felt almost sacred. Jason looked up at her, his expression tired but softer than she'd seen in weeks. "We lost the deal," he said simply. Grace glanced at her father, who gave nothing away except the faintest nod. She set the dish down and touched her brother's shoulder. "Then maybe you won something else." Jason managed a faint smile. For the first time he didn't argue. That night, as Jason prepared to leave, James walked him to the door. The air outside was crisp, the stars faint above the suburban street. "Jason," James said, his voice steady, "I've carried many loads in my life, some heavier than I thought I could bear, but none as heavy as the thought of carrying your mistakes for you. They're yours to carry, and yours to learn from. That's how you grow." Jason stood there, the words sinking deeper than he expected. He nodded slowly, his eyes shimmering in the porch light. I think I understand." James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, firm but gentle. "You will, in time." Jason walked down the path, shoulders still heavy but his steps a little steadier than before. James watched until he disappeared into the night, then turned back inside, the house quiet once more. He knew there would be more battles, more disappointments, more lessons. But for now, he had done the hardest thing a father could do. He had loved his son enough to let him fall. Sparkles, sometimes the strongest love is not the one that shields us, but the one that trusts us to stand after we stumble. Discipline may bruise the pride, but it saves the future. And in the shadows of family, it is often silence that speaks the loudest truths. Thank you for watching this story on Family Shadows. If it touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own family or the sacrifices that love sometimes demands, we'd be honored if you subscribe to our channel. Every story here is a reminder that families, in all their struggles and silences, carry lessons worth sharing. We wish you health, peace, and happiness for you and for your family. Until next time, may your shadows remind you of the light they protect.